Beer, a beverage that has stood the test of time and for good reason. It's the result of putting 4 simple ingredients together to create a solution that has just as much math and chemistry as it is delicious. Today, we're brewing a beer by the numbers. Beer has 4 main ingredients, starting with water. If you want good beer, you need good water, and many brewers will alter the water chemistry for a certain style just to get the beer right. Next would be the grains. These come in the way of malted barley, wheat, rye, or oats, and they provide the fermentable sugars that yeast will use to produce alcohol and CO2. Next would be the hops. This provides the bitterness and the aroma that you get from different styles of beer. Finally, we have yeast. The organisms called yeast will eat up fermentable sugars and produce alcohol and CO2. In other words, they make the beer. Brewing a beer is as much an art as it is a science, and it's very easy to get it wrong. So we need to follow the numbers, follow the recipes, and follow the guidelines to get the beer style that we want to brew right. The style that I'll be brewing is called a white IPA, and it's a cross between a Belgian wit and a New England IPA. We're going to start off with water. 5 gallons of beer is what we're going for, so we start with 7.5 gallons of strike water, which will heat to 168 degrees Fahrenheit. In some particular setups, they use a sparge system, but we are going to be recirculating our wort. The mash, which contains the grains, will have 3.5 pounds of white wheat, 2 pounds of 2-row pale malt, 3 pounds of Pilsner malt, 2 pounds of flaked wheat, 1.5 pounds of flaked oats to give us a total of 12 pounds of grains. When we look at what we're doing with the hops, we have 1 ounce of Cascade hops added at 60 minutes in the boil, 1 ounce of Amarillo hops at 10 minutes left of the boil, and 1 ounce of Amarillo and 2 ounces of Mosaic hops in what we call the whirlpool stage of the boil. Finally, when we are ready to introduce yeast, we'll be using imperial yeast, and this one is a strain called Genome or Gnome B45, and it's a packet that contains 200 billion cells of yeast. Yeast must be pitched at a very specific temperature in order to be active and not to be killed off. Step 1. So we're going to heat our strike water to 168 degrees Fahrenheit. This is a higher temperature than we want to mash in at, because when we add the grains to the water, the temperature will drop significantly. And so to get us at the right temperature, we start out at 168 degrees Fahrenheit for our beer. Step 2 would be to mill our grains. Now the grains are malted barley, wheat, etc., and they come dried and kilned, and we're going to crush them up but not grind them down to a powder. Just enough to break the hulls and release the starches that'll ultimately provide the sugars that the yeast will eat and provide alcohol and CO2. Mixing different grains together before putting them into the mash will ensure that everything is mixed well together. I'm also using some rice hulls in the mash here to help filter out some of the grains that might get stuck together during the mash. So into our strike water, we're going to start adding in our grains, and we're aiming for a mash temperature of 152 degrees. We're going to hold it there at 152 degrees for about 60 minutes. This is the stage called the mash, and what we're trying to do is bring down that temperature before we close it up down to exactly the 152 degrees. Then we'll seal it up for 60 minutes. We stir the mash to help reduce the temperature until we get it to the sweet spot. Finally, we arrive at the temperature we're aiming for, between 152 and 154 degrees. Now we sit and wait a 60-minute mash. The next stage of beer making is called boiling the wort. The wort is like a tea that we gather from the grains after steeping in the hot water. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to drain the wort from the grains. And the wort, if you ever had tasted the wort before it goes into the boil, it has a very cereal-like flavor, taste, and smell to it. Draining all the wort, we start getting our temperature up to a boil of 212 degrees. So from 152 degrees, it's going to take a little time to get up to the boil. So as we drain our grains, we power up the anvil and we get it ready to rock and roll for a nice rolling boil at 212 degrees. Once we hit 212 degrees, that'll be when we can start timing our boil for 60 minutes. We do a 60-minute mash and typically a 60-minute boil on the wort. One of the things that we notice after we've collected all the wort is that we have a significant drop in volume. And this is why we started with 7.5 gallons of strike water, aiming for 5 gallons of beer. We've also introduced a hop basket so that we can collect the hops, steep them in the beer, but not collect all the vegetative matter that might come along with that. So after we've reached a boil, we first add our 60-minute hop addition. This will be 1 ounce of Cascade hops in pellet form. Hops added in the beginning of the boil give beer its bitterness, and the bitterness of a beer is measured in something called IBUs. Our beer here will have 44 IBUs. There are many styles of beer, and to try all of them would take a lifetime. Focus on beers that you like to drink if you're going to brew one. With 10 minutes left to the boil, we add our next hop addition, and it's 1 ounce of Amarillo hops. This hop addition will add more of an aroma and a flavor addition to the beer rather than a bittering addition. IPAs are known for a strong hop character. Additional additives or adjuncts that we might add to our beer. So typically we add a Warflock tablet at the end of the boil at 10 minutes. This helps clear the haze from the beer. And here I'm adding some extra things like coriander seeds and orange blossom honey to add some flavors that would be characteristic of a wit beer. Now at 10 minutes we should also add the wort chiller, which will help us bring the temperature down, and this needs to be added at 10 minutes to help sanitize it. At the end of 60 minutes we call this flame out, and we begin to chill the wort down to 180 degrees to what we call the whirlpool stage. The whirlpool will be held at 180 degrees for approximately 15 to 20 minutes, where we'll add a few more hop additions, and this will really add to some flavor and aroma that we'll get in our final product. So we'll be adding in 1 more ounce of Amarillo hops in pellet form, as well as 2 ounces of Mosaic hops. This will give a little bit of a melon character to it. Next, we clean and sanitize the fermenter, which is where the wort will sit and ferment, and we sanitize it using something called Star San. Once the wort is cooled to 76 degrees, optimal for the yeast to live and thrive, we will then pitch the yeast and they will take action. The yeast will begin to go to work and start converting the wort to beer. Different yeasts have different pitch rates, and of course, different beer styles have different yeasts. We're measuring specific gravity, which is really the density of the beer, before and after the alcohol has been produced. The density of water is a measure of 1, and a hydrometer will tell us what the density or specific gravity of our beer is before. The final gravity will be measured after the fermentation, and it is the difference between the starting or specific gravity to the final gravity that will give us the alcohol content of our beer, or sometimes known as the ABV for short. Our white IPA measures a specific gravity of 1060, and in 2 weeks fermentation time, it should be complete. We're hoping to measure a final gravity of 1010. Fermentation control is important in getting the beer right, and at 68 degrees for 2 weeks, we use a blow-off tube to allow excess CO2 to release and to make sure no extra oxygen gets into the beer and ruins it at this stage. Now we wait. See you in a few weeks.